We've seen a little bit of why object-oriented programming is really useful, but now let's take a look at how you would actually go about implementing object-oriented programming. So in the last lesson, we talked of this example of the restaurant, where we hired 3 types of staff, and we had a manager who would then manage all of these 3 different types of staff. Now, the reason why object-oriented programming is called that is because it's trying to model a real-world object. So let's say that we are creating a virtual restaurant. Well, in this case, we probably have to model a virtual chef, waiter, cleaner, and manager. So let's say that we were going to model a waiter. In order to model our waiter, there's probably 2 things we need to think about: what it has and what it does. In terms of what it has, well, it might have variables like, is it holding a plate, true or false? Or which tables is it responsible for? Maybe table 4, 5, and 6. Now, it also has things that it does. Maybe they're able to take an order to the chef, and maybe they also need to take payment and add money to the restaurant. So these 2 different things, what the waiter has and what the waiter does, are the 2 most important things that make up an object: its attributes and its methods. By looking at the code, you can pretty much see that the attributes is basically a variable. An attribute is just a fancy word for a variable that's associated with a modeled object, like our waiter here. Because it's not just a free-floating bit of variable, right? It's not just somewhere in our main.python. It's actually a variable that's attached to a particular object. It's the waiter's tables responsible. Now, the method goes along the same vein. These, as you can clearly see, are just functions. But we call it a method because it's a function that a particular modeled object can do. We need a waiter object to take the order, and we need a waiter object to take payment. Again, these are not just free-floating functions. Now, there's a lot of new words that are part of object-oriented programming and programming in general. We're going to see them again and again, and eventually it's going to become a word that's going to be in your dictionary. But for now, just remember that in object-oriented programming, we're trying to model real-life objects. And those objects have things, and they also can do things. The things that they have are their attributes, and these are usually modeled with variables. And the things that they can do are called methods, and they are modeled by functions. So essentially, an object is just a way of combining some piece of data and some functionality all together in the same thing. But we can actually have multiple objects generated from the same type. So when we've modeled a particular job in our virtual restaurant, like the waiter's job, and we've figured out what are the things that the waiter have and what are the things that it can do, well, we can actually generate multiple versions of the same object. So we could have Henry, who's a waiter, and we can also have Betty, who's a waiter. And we can generate as many of these as we want from the same blueprint. And in OOP, we call this blueprint or this type a class. And we call these individual objects that are generated from the blueprint an object. So now let's take a look how we use these class blueprints to create an actual object.